Hello again. In this video, we're going to talk all about cropping and aspect ratios. Now, I know that sounds a little silly to do a whole video on cropping and aspect ratios, but understanding aspect ratio and why it's important is probably one of the hardest concepts for new photographers to grasp. But once you get it, it's all of a sudden just going to start making sense. So first of all, what is aspect ratio? Well, the definition is aspect ratio is the proportional relationship between height and width. Okay, great. So what's that mean? In other words, this is why photos look rectangular and other photos look square. And say, for example, why you can't post your 16 by 9 photo, which is a rectangular photo, on Instagram because of the aspect ratio. So some of the most common aspect ratios are 16 by 9, 4 by 3, 4 by 5, 3 by 2, and 1 by 1. So let's break those down a little bit. What's used for what? So 16 by 9 is the first one. That's this aspect ratio right here. This is probably the most common aspect ratio you'll see. Most modern monitors and phones use 16 by 9s. And for phones, just turn your phone horizontally, and that's a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. The next one, 4 by 3. That's this aspect ratio right here. Now, before widescreen monitors were commonplace, this was the standard screen ratio for TVs and monitors. So this is why you get the black letter boxes on the sides when you try to watch something that was filmed in a 4 by 3 aspect ratio on a modern 16 by 9 widescreen monitor. The next aspect ratio is 4 by 5. That's this aspect ratio right here. Now this one is used by two main platforms, Instagram and Facebook. Or if you're printing your photos, this is an 8 by 10. The next aspect ratio is 3 by 2. That's this aspect ratio. Now this used to be the standard aspect ratio for 35mm film cameras. And some cameras, like the Canon Rebel, still shoot in 3 by 2. The final aspect ratio is 1 by 1. That's this. In other words, it's a perfect square. So what's this all mean? Again, like I said, this is why you can't post your 16 by 9 photo on Instagram, which is a 4 by 5 aspect ratio. Well, you can, but it'll get cut off for it to fit in the frame. The photo, the 16 by 9 photo, is simply too wide to fit in a 4 by 5 aspect ratio frame on Instagram. Like this, see, it's just not going to work. Your photo's too big. This is also why, conversely, you can't have a photo that you posted on Instagram in the 4 by 5 aspect ratio be, say for example, your Facebook cover photo, which is more of a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. The picture isn't wide enough for it to fill the frame. So at the end of the day, you need to know what platform uses what aspect ratio and what ratio you'll need to use to get your photos to display right. All right, great. Now I know all about aspect ratio. But what about cropping? Well, here's where you can kind of get a little creative. Generally, if you crop it 16 by 9, that's the rectangular aspect ratio, that's the common one, that can generally give a little bit more of a cinematic type look versus, say, a 4 by 5 aspect ratio, the one that Instagram uses, sort of more of a square. So say, for example, if you're going for more of a vintage style look, let's say you're shooting a picture of a warbird, and you're trying to do a nice black and white edit, you'd probably want to be in a 4 by 3 aspect ratio, or maybe even a 2 by 3, which is what cameras used to shoot in. Now be creative with your cropping. Don't feel like your subject always has to be perfectly centered in the frame. You can do maybe a little bit of an offset picture where, say for example, your subject, let's say you're doing a picture of airplanes on the ground and you've got some pilots walking out. You could have, say, the aircraft off to the side and the pilots walking to the aircraft. Work with your objects rather than against them. If you've got buildings or a person that can maybe show scale or adds to the photo in some way, remember we're trying to tell a story here, leave it in. The next thing is leave some space to fly into. One of the things that I've noticed a lot of new photographers do is when they crop right to the nose of the aircraft. I generally don't do that. I generally like to leave my planes to give some space to fly into, kind of like this. And also, when you crop really, really tight, you're going to lose a lot of resolution. Finally, don't be afraid to show some of the sky. Use negative space, especially if you've got a really, really good sky. Let's say you shot this in the evening and you've got some really nice clouds in the background. Don't crop those out. Work with them. All right, so now I've given you some general tips and tricks about cropping and aspect ratios. In our next video, we're finally going to get into editing. So please stay tuned.